I shoot a lot of different kind of photos. I do weddings, event photography, and portrait professionally. And I also love shooting street photography, toy photography, landscape. But I'm not a wildlife photographer and I don't shoot a lot of sports. So even though I have quite a lot of lenses at home, the longest focal length lens that I have is only 200mm. But from time to time, I do want to have a longer lens, a Super Telephoto lens for some special photos, but I just can't justify spending a few $1,000s to buy a Super Telephoto lens to shoot maybe just a few photos a year. There are some Super Telephoto lenses available in the market for around US $200 or so, but the quality of those lenses are really not that good. I might as well just shoot with my 200mm lens and crop in, and I'll probably get better image quality and more details than one of those very cheap Super Telephoto lenses. A few months ago when I was chatting with TTArtisan, they told me they have a Super Telephoto lens coming soon. It is a full frame lens and will be available for Sony E, Nikon Z, Canon RF and L-mount. And the best thing is, the price is only US $329. So it's just a little bit over US $300 for a 500mm lens. They asked me if I'm interested in reviewing this lens. I'm super interested because it is not common to see a new Super Telephoto lens, and TTArtisan, they make good quality lenses with very attractive price. So I'm really interested to find out whether this lens could be a great affordable choice for those of us who want to have a Super Telephoto lens but don't want to spend a lot of money. So the lens that we are looking at today is the TTArtisan 500mm f6.3. And before we start, the usual disclaimer, this lens was supplied by TTArtisan for this review, but as usual, this is a completely independent review and I will share with you the things that I like and don't like about this lens. Let's start the review by looking at the image sharpness first. At the maximum aperture f6.3, the center of the photo, it has a tiny bit of softness and the contrast is also a little bit low, but overall the center image quality is still pretty acceptable. Once I stop down to f8, the sharpness and contrast both improves quite a bit and it becomes sharpest at f11. After that, it becomes softer due to diffraction. If we look at the corner, at f6.3, the corner is a bit soft and has a bit of glow effect in this test photo, but I could still read the small letters here. Stop down to f8, it becomes better and the corner becomes sharpest at f11. So overall, if your subject is at or near the center of the frame, you could just shoot at f6.3. If you need good corner sharpness, then I think you need to stop down to at least f8. The minimum focus distance of this TTArtisan 500mm lens is 3.3 meter, which sounds like a really long distance, but remember it is a 500mm lens. This is a photo I shot at the minimum focus distance, and the sharpness is also acceptable even at f6.3, but stop down the lens to f8 would help. Because of the long focal length, depth of field is really shallow, almost paper thin when you're shooting at f6.3 at or near minimum focus distance, so you would probably want to stop down the lens a little bit. With such a long focal length, it is extremely easy to dissolve the background and melt the background completely. Bokeh usually looks pretty pleasant, not nervous at all. Bokeh balls are round even when you stop down the lens. Even at small aperture, the bokeh balls are still relatively round. However, I said usually, not always, because sometimes the bokeh balls they do have a halo ring at the outside edge, and there could also be a bit of onion ring patterns as well. So for some photographers, you may find it look a bit messy, but some photographers may like it as it does add a bit of character to the photos shot with this lens. Let's have a look at this lens vignetting performance. This is the test photo that I shot at the maximum aperture f6.3. There is virtually no vignetting at all. That is pretty impressive. When I stop down the lens, apart from some really minor changes from f6.3 to f8, the results look virtually identical. Okay, next, let's have a look at chromatic aberration. When I'm going through the few hundred photos that I shot with this lens, most of the photos have very minimum amount of color fringing, not really that noticeable at all. So I would say it's not bad. However, with this test photo, which has really high contrast, I can see some pretty noticeable color fringing. This is the worst example I have from the hundreds of photos that I shot with this lens. Most other photos have much less color fringing than this. But if you are shooting photos of a very high contrast scene with this lens, then you need to be a bit careful if you want to minimize the amount of color fringing. Telephoto lens, especially telephoto prime lens, usually has very little amount of distortion. And this TTArtisan 500mm f6.3 lens is also the same. Because this lens has no electronic contacts, so it has no lens profile correction, but still there is very minimal amount of distortion, pretty much nothing even when we look at this brick wall test photo. From my previous TTArtisan reviews, I very often find lens flare is the biggest weakness of TTArtisan lenses, and with this 500mm lens flare is also one of the weakest area in terms of image quality. When there is a strong light source in front of the lens, you may see a bit of lens flare. It could also cause the contrast to drop a bit. Fortunately, this doesn't happen very often. Most of my photos, I don't have too much lens flare issue. The lens also comes with a lens hood. Because of the long focal length, the lens hood does help reduce the lens flare when the light source is just outside the frame. We'll have a look at Sunstars now. It's been a while since I last tested a Super Telephoto lens, and it's actually quite hard to test Sunstars for a lens with such long focal length because you need to find a light source that is far away from you and yet bright enough so that you can test the Sunstars. But anyway, from my test photos, I would say this lens is not really optimized for nice looking Sunstars. You don't really get any sharp Sunstars at all even when you stop down the lens. In this set of test photos, I have to stop down all the way to f32, then the Sunstars starting to have long tails. TTArtisan has sent me some information and photos of the lens before I received the sample, so I know this is not a small lens. But when I received it, I was still a bit surprised by the size of the lens. The weight of the lens is just over 1.5 kg, or just a bit over 3.3 pounds. But then size and weight, they are all relative. After all, this is a 500mm lens, so if I compare it to other 500mm lens, then the size and weight, they are both okay. When I first saw the photo, I thought this area at the front is the lens hood, so I can probably remove it and reverse it when I put it into storage. But no, this is actually part of the lens. The lens hood is separate, and if you install it, it will make the lens even longer. Build quality of this lens is pretty decent. It has full metal construction. The lens feels very solid. Everything feels nice. I really like the fonts and design of this front area. It makes the lens looks nice and doesn't look cheap. It is a completely mechanical and manual lens, so there's no autofocus, no electronic contacts. Make sure you enter the focal length correctly on your camera body, or the camera's in-body image stabilization system would not work correctly. Because it's quite a big but not exactly lightweight lens, the lens comes with a tripod mount which is rotatable and removable. The tripod mount feels very solid. However, I found the locking mechanism a little bit hard to use. What I mean is, it's not exactly easy to completely lock the tripod mount. There are 2 screw holes on the tripod mount, which is great, but at the same time I'm a bit disappointed. The tripod mount is not a built-in Arca Swiss quick release plate itself, so I have to attach my quick release plate to the tripod mount. If you want to use a filter with this lens, the front filter thread is 82mm, which is really good for a 500mm lens. The mechanical aperture ring is at the front and is from f6.3 to f32. Most of the TTArtisan lenses aperture ring has clicks, but surprisingly the aperture ring of this 500mm lens is declicked. It is also a bit tight, so you need to apply a bit of force to turn it. Many focus ring has the focus throw of approximately 180 degrees. It is also a little bit tight. If you want to use this lens for video, one really important thing is you need a tripod, or at the very least a monopod. Since this lens has no optical image stabilization at all, if your camera doesn't have IBIS, then you can forget about it. The image will become pretty unusable. Even with IBIS, like I tested with the Lumix S5 II, which has a pretty good video IBIS, the image could still be really quite shaky. With a good tripod and a solid tripod head, then you can get some good stable footage. Focus breathing is actually not bad, but because of the very narrow field of view and the focus ring is pretty tight, it is almost impossible to avoid shaking the image if you turn the focus ring during video recording. A 500mm Super Telephoto lens is usually not cheap at all. So for many of us, Super Telephoto lens is just something that we want to get but may never get one because of the expensive price. While there are some cheap options available in the market, they are usually pretty nasty with very poor image quality. So when TTArtisan told me about this lens, the specs and the price, I was a bit surprised, but also not too sure what I should expect. I know it won't be quite the same as a 500mm prime lens from first party, as those lenses are easily 10 times more expensive or even more. So I wasn't expecting that kind of image quality. So it could be either terrible, like most budget Super Telephoto lenses in the market, or maybe it would be a lens that is good enough that I would actually use myself. After using it for about 2 months now, I would say yes, it is a lens that I would use it myself. Image quality wise, it is definitely far from perfect. For example, the lens flare is still an issue, and chromatic aberration could be noticeable if you are shooting some very high contrast scene. But consider the very affordable price, and it is a 500mm lens. I think the overall image quality is acceptable. It's actually not bad at all. It's slightly soft but still very usable at f6.3. Unless you really need very good corner sharpness, and it becomes much sharper once I stop down to f8. If you have never shot with a Super Telephoto manual-focus lens or even a manual-focus lens before, I think this would be the biggest concern. Depth of field is really shallow with this lens, so you have to focus very carefully to keep your subject in focus. It is not a fault of the lens itself, it's just the physical behavior of a Super Telephoto lens. It means this is really not a lens for shooting action, bird in flight, or anything that the focus distance will be changing all the time unless you're really good with manual focus. But if your subject is static, it is very doable. I myself got really good success rate when shooting with this lens. So I think it's a lens with overall good enough performance and a very attractive price. It could be an excellent choice for those of us that want a super telephoto lens but don't want to spend a lot of money. So would you be interested in this lens? Do you want to see more super telephoto lenses from TTArtisan? By the way, I went to TTArtisan's headquarters in Shenzhen recently and I did an interview with their founder, Mr. Lee. We talk about many things including some of their upcoming products. So if you haven't watched the interview yet, you should watch it now.